The Montana wind in March of 1890 didn't just blow, it bit. It tore through the thin wool of Ethan's coat as he stood over the fresh mounds of earth in the churchyard, his hand gripping his 12-year-old brother's shoulder, so hard his knuckles turned white. "It's a kindness I'm offering, son. Don't be mule-headed." Ethan didn't look up. He knew the voice. It was Mr. Silas, the cattle baron whose land swallowed half the county. Silas tapped his cane against his boot, impatient. "That slip of land your daddy bought, folks in town are already calling it the Fool's Slice. It's nothing but a gash between two granite cliffs. No pasture, no timber, and definitely no flat ground to set a foundation. It's a dead inheritance, Ethan." "It's ours," Ethan said, his voice raspy. "It's a death trap," Silas corrected, adjusting his beaver felt hat. "Sell me the deed for $10. I'll use it for drainage. You can head out to the mines in Butte, and the Reverend has arranged a spot for little Leo at the St. Jude Orphanage in Helena. It's the only responsible choice." At the word orphanage, Leo flinched. Ethan dropped to one knee, ignoring the mud soaking his trousers, and looked Leo in the eye. He saw the terror there, fragile and raw. "No one is going anywhere," Ethan whispered, the words fierce and low. "We promised Mama and Pa. We stay together. Always." He stood up, tipped his hat to the rich man, and steered Leo toward the wagon. They rode in silence to their new property, located at the mouth of what locals called Devil's Throat. When they arrived, the reality hit Ethan like a physical blow. Silas was right. It wasn't land, it was a mistake. The property was barely 40 feet wide, squeezed between towering vertical walls of sheer granite. And right down the middle, taking up nearly every inch of usable space, roared a creek swollen with spring runoff. "Where do we put the house, Ethan?" Leo asked, his teeth chattering. The sun was dipping below the canyon walls, plunging them into early shadow. Ethan looked for a flat patch, a grassy knoll, anything. There was nothing but jagged scree and the rushing water. Despair, heavy and cold, settled in his gut. He had dragged his brother to a pile of rocks just to be stubborn. "Wash up, Leo," Ethan said, trying to hide the tremble in his voice. We'll set up a lean-to against the cliff wall for tonight." Leo knelt by the creek. He looked small, too delicate for this harsh country. He dipped his cupped hands into the water to splash his face, bracing for the freeze of snowmelt. Suddenly, Leo yelped. "Ethan!" Ethan scrambled over the rocks, heart hammering. "What? Did you fall?" "The water." Leo stared at his wet hands, wide-eyed. "It's not ice, it's like tea. It's warm," Ethan frowned. He stripped off his glove and plunged his hand into the current. He expected the bite of the mountain winter. Instead, a silky, surprising warmth wrapped around his fingers. It wasn't boiling, but it was tepid, heated by some deep, volcanic vein beneath the bitter roots. "It's a hot spring," Ethan breathed, looking upstream. The steam was rising faintly now that the air was cooling. He looked at the water, the very thing that made the land useless. Then he looked up at the two solid cliffs bracketing them like fortress walls. The heat from the water rose up, trapped between the rock faces, creating a pocket of warm air. A crazy, inventive spark fired in Ethan's mind. It was absurd. It was impossible. But it was the only way to keep the promise. "Mr. Silas is right, Leo," Ethan said, a slow, wild grin breaking through his grief. "We can't build a house on the land." He pointed to the solid rock walls on either side of the creek. "So we're going to build the house over the water." Summer in the canyon didn't bring relief. It brought a humid, stifling heat trapped between the granite walls. By July, the town of Blackwood had given the boys a new name. They weren't just the Miller orphans anymore. They were the river rats living in Miller's Folly. Ethan spent his days waist-deep in the current. He was persistent, driving distinct cedar posts into the rocky creek bed until his muscles screamed. Cedar was the only wood that wouldn't rot in the wet, a lesson he'd learned from an old trapper before the funeral. He worked with a desperate, obsessive rhythm. Heave the mallet, strike the post, pray it holds. On the banks, 12-year-old Leo was just as industrious. He was too light to drive the piles, so he became the mudlark. He scoured the creek banks for clay, mixing it with river moss and straw to create chinking for the walls. He looked like a mud-caked sprite, his face smeared with gray earth, but his eyes were bright with optimistic focus. "They're taking bets at the saloon," Ethan said one evening, wringing out his soaked trousers by the fire. Mr. Silas put $5 on the whole thing washing away before the first snowfall. Leo didn't look up from the floorboards he was arranging. "Let him lose his money. Look at this, Ethan." Leo pointed to the floor. It wasn't a solid deck. He had designed a system of hinged trapdoors right into the timber. "We don't have a root cellar," Leo explained, his voice earnest. "But if we put the milk and butter in a tin pail and lower it on a rope through this hatch, the water keeps it cool. And this hatch here? We open it in the summer to let the breeze come up through the floor. The creek breathes for us." Ethan stared at the mechanism. It was ingenious. But as night fell, the doubt crept back in, a cold, cynical snake coiling in his gut. Later that night, the fatigue hit Ethan like a sledgehammer. His hands were raw, the skin peeling from being waterlogged for 12 hours a day. He sat on a crate, head in his hands, staring at the dark, rushing water beneath the floor joists. The structure creaked. Every groan of the wood sounded like failure. "What am I doing?" he thought. "I'm 18 now. I could be working a mine. Leo could be warm in an orphanage bed. Instead, I've got him sleeping above a drowning hazard. Am I killing him?" He was ready to quit. He was ready to walk into town at dawn and sign the deed over to Silas. Then he heard a scratching sound. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Ethan looked over. By the light of a single tallow candle, Leo was sitting cross-legged, holding a piece of rough pine railing. He was sanding it. Not quickly, but with a meticulous, gentle care. "Leo, go to sleep," Ethan rasped. "It's late." "Almost done," Leo murmured, not stopping. "I saw you got a splinter from this rail yesterday. It was deep. I'm making sure it's smooth so it doesn't hurt your hands tomorrow." Ethan looked at his brother's small, tired profile. Leo wasn't afraid. He was building a home. He was taking care of Ethan just as much as Ethan was taking care of him. The shame of wanting to quit vanished, replaced by a protective ferocity that burned hotter than the geothermal spring below them. Ethan stood up, walked over, and ruffled Leo's hair. "It's smooth enough, Leo," Ethan said, his voice thick. "It's perfect. Now get some rest. We've got a roof to raise tomorrow." November arrived with the fury of a scorned woman. The first blizzard of the season buried Montana under 4 feet of snow in a single night. The wind howled through the canyon like a freight train, rattling the shutters of every homestead in Blackwood. But inside the Miller shack, The world was silent and shockingly tranquil. Ethan sat in his rocking chair, a mug of coffee resting on his knee. He wasn't wearing a heavy wool coat. He wasn't even wearing boots. He was in his stocking feet, resting them directly on the pine floorboards. The foolish idea had worked better than even he had dared to dream. The geothermal spring, flowing endlessly beneath their foundation, acted as a massive, natural radiator. The heat rose through the gaps in the planks and the trapdoors, trapped by the steep canyon walls and the thick insulation of the cabin roof. While the temperature outside plummeted to 20 degrees below zero, the cabin remained a steady, balmy 70 degrees. "Got one." Ethan looked up from oiling his Winchester rifle. In the center of the kitchen, Leo was sitting by the open trapdoor. Steam curled up from the opening, filling the room with a mist that made the boy look like he was sitting in the clouds. He pulled a shimmering trout up through the floor, the fish flopping onto the warm wood. "That's dinner," Leo beamed, his face flushed and cheerful. Ethan chuckled, a sound that felt foreign after months of anxiety. "You're the only fisherman in Montana catching trout in his socks, Leo." Later that evening, the boys indulged in a luxury that not even the mayor of Blackwood could afford in the dead of winter. They dragged the galvanized tin tub to the center of the room. Leo opened the water hatch, dropped a bucket into the steaming current below, and hauled it up. Within minutes, Leo was soaking in a hot bath, scrubbing off the week's grime. The room smelled of pine sap and river steam. It was a scene of extravagant comfort amidst a frozen hellscape. Ethan wiped the last speck of grease from his rifle barrel, feeling a profound sense of competence. He walked to the single glass window facing down the valley. The glass was clear, kept frost-free by the radiant heat inside. Through the swirling snow, he could just make out the property line of the Circle S Ranch. Down there, a lantern bobbed in the darkness. It was Mr. Silas. The old cattle baron was bundled in furs, hacking violently at the frozen surface of a water trough with a pickaxe. His cattle were lowing, thirsty, and miserable, huddled against the wind. Silas looked small, shivering as the gale nearly knocked him over. He was fighting the mountain, and the mountain was winning. Ethan took a sip of his coffee. It was still hot. For the first time in his life, Ethan didn't feel like the poor orphan boy. He watched the richest man in the county, freezing in the dark, while he and his brother sat in a steam-heated fortress. "Ethan?" Leo asked, toweling off his hair by the fire. "Is the storm bad?" Ethan turned back to the warmth of the room, a satisfied smile touching his lips. "I can't hardly tell, Leo," he said softly. "I can't hardly tell." The paradise of November proved to be a deceptive lull. In late January, the sky turned the color of a bruised plum, and the great blizzard descended upon Montana with catastrophic fury. For 3 days, the sun did not rise. The canyon, usually their shield, became a wind tunnel. Gale-force winds screamed through the gap, battering the cabin with the force of a battering ram. The temperature plunged to 40 below, a cold so savage it snapped tree limbs like dry kindling. Inside, the situation was turning desperate. "The wood!" Ethan yelled over the roar of the wind, staring into the wood box. It was empty. They had burned through their winter cord faster than calculated. The fire in the hearth sputtered and died, reducing to gray ash. Immediately, the bitter cold began to claw its way through the chinking. The windows frosted over in seconds, But the cold wasn't the worst enemy. It was the vibration. The house shuddered violently with every gust. "The piles, Ethan!" Leo cried out, clutching the table leg. "Can they hold?" Ethan was on his hands and knees, pressing his ear to the floorboards. Beneath them, the creek was roaring, swollen and angry. He imagined the cedar posts twisting, the ice floes battering their foundation. He felt powerless, a tiny speck against the crushing weight of nature. "I don't know," Ethan confessed, his voice cracking with hysterical fear. "I don't know, Leo. I thought I was smart. I thought I could cheat the winter. But I've just built us a coffin." The cabin gave a sickening lurch. Ethan scrambled across the floor and grabbed Leo, pulling him into the center of the room. They huddled together under their quilt, but the air was freezing. "We have to open the floor," Ethan realized. It was a reckless gamble. All of it. He scrambled to the trapdoors, usually reserved for summer cooling, and threw them wide open. Steam billowed up from the darkness below. It wasn't the gentle mist of autumn. In the freezing air, it was a thick, blinding fog. It smelled of sulfur and wet rock. The humidity soaked their clothes, but as the heat filled the room, the biting frost receded. They were living inside a cloud, suspended over a boiling abyss. Ethan held his brother tight, his body trembling. "I'm sorry, Leo. I'm so sorry. I should have sent you to the orphanage. You'd be safe on solid ground." Leo pulled back slightly. In the eerie gray light of the steam, his face was surprisingly composed. He wasn't crying. "Listen to the water, Ethan," Leo whispered. "What?" "Pa used to say it," Leo said, his voice steady and resolute. "Rock is stubborn, so it cracks. Water is patient, so it survives. We aren't fighting the storm, Ethan. We're letting it pass over us. We're just like the water." Ethan looked at his little brother. The boy who was too weak to swing a hammer was now the iron spine of the family. The house groaned again, a terrifying sound, but Leo didn't flinch. He just breathed in the warm, sulphurous steam. Ethan rested his chin on Leo's head, the panic slowly receding into a stoic determination. They sat in the dark, wrapped in the breath of the earth, waiting for the wind to die or the world to end. The silence that followed the great blizzard was louder than the wind. The sun rose on the fourth day, blindingly bright, casting the canyon in a glittering diamond dust light. By noon, a somber procession struggled up the canyon floor. Mr. Silas led them, his face gray and grim. Behind him were the town sheriff and the reverend, carrying shovels. They weren't coming for a rescue. They were coming for a recovery. In town, roofs had collapsed, and livestock had frozen solid in the barns. No one believed that a shack straddling a creek could survive when sturdy homesteads had failed. "We'll make it quick," Silas muttered, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "The ground will be too hard to dig, but we can't leave the boys in there." They rounded the bend and stopped dead. The Miller shack was not a pile of splintered wood. It was standing. But what made the men gasp was the halo surrounding it. While the rest of the canyon was choked with 5 feet of snow, the roof of the shack was bare and dripping. A circle of melted earth surrounded the structure, green grass peeking through the mud. Before Silas could find his voice, the front door swung open. A massive cloud of white steam rolled out, followed by Ethan. He wasn't frozen. He wasn't blue-lipped. He was wearing just his flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up, looking healthy and well-rested. "Morning, Mr. Silas," Ethan called out, his voice ringing clear against the canyon walls. "You look froze to the bone. Best come inside. Leo's got the coffee hot." Silas dropped his shovel. The metal clang echoed like a gunshot. The wealthy cattle baron stepped onto the bridge house, his boots heavy with snow. Inside, the air was tropical. The humidity from the open floor hatches had kept the wood from cracking and the boys from freezing. It was a marvel of ingenious engineering. Leo was sitting by the stove, whittling a new spoon. He looked up and smiled, innocent and alive. Silas took off his hat, crushing the brim in his hands. He looked around the warm, sturdy room, a fortress built on useless water. He looked at Ethan, seeing not a foolish boy, but a man of extraordinary capability. "I called this the fool's slice," Silas said, his voice raspy with shame. He looked Ethan in the eye. "But it seems I'm the fool, son. You didn't just survive the storm. You outsmarted it." Ethan rested his hand on Leo's shoulder. "We just kept our promise, sir. That's all." Spring came early to the canyon that year. The snowmelt roared beneath their floorboards, a sound of victory. The town no longer mocked the brothers. The narrow strip of land was removed from the unsellable registry and given a new name on the county map, Miller's Warm Landing. Ethan and Leo stood on their porch, watching the water rush by. They had no gold, no cattle, and no flat ground. But they had a home that the mountain couldn't break, and they had each other. They had proven that even a dead inheritance can bloom if you have the courage to see it differently. Question for the audience. If you were left with a useless piece of land like Ethan and Leo, would you have sold it to survive or tried to build something impossible? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of American grit and brotherhood, please smash that subscribe button and hit the bell so you never miss a tale.